Today, Paris is a city of broad boulevards, tourist routes, and the architectural symbols of the 19th and 20th centuries. But in the 18th century, Paris looked completely different. It was one of the largest cities in the world with a population of around 600 to 650,000 people, overcrowded, noisy, and poorly suited to the life of so many inhabitants. Today, thanks to the capabilities of artificial intelligence, these materials can be not only examined, but visually brought to life. We invite you on a virtual tour of 18th century Paris to see the city as it was before the Revolution, before the barricades, and before the large-scale reconstruction of the 19th century. If you enjoy the video, we ask you to subscribe and leave a like. This will help the channel grow. 18th century Paris developed without a single master plan. Its structure largely retained a medieval character. Narrow, winding streets, dense multi-story building, houses with overhanging upper floors that nearly touched above the roadway. In many districts, daylight barely reached the ground. Street width often did not exceed 3 to 4 meters, which made the movement of carts and pedestrians extremely difficult. The city was clearly divided into functional zones that had formed historically. The Ile de la Cité remained the historical and administrative center. It was home to Notre Dame Cathedral, the Palace of Justice, the Conciergerie prison, and the residences of royal officials. The island was densely built up and connected to the banks by many bridges. Many bridges were lined with residential houses and shops, which worsened ventilation and made these places especially vulnerable to fires and epidemics. The right bank of the Seine was the most densely populated and commercially active. Markets, commercial streets, artisans' workshops, warehouses, and cheap housing were located there. The central hub of this area was Les Halles, an enormous food complex supplying the entire city with meat, fish, grain, and vegetables. The market operated almost around the clock. Conflicts, thefts, and food disturbances constantly arose around it, especially in years of poor harvests and rising bread prices. The left bank was considered more scholarly and religious. It housed the university colleges of the Sorbonne, printing houses, bookshops, and monasteries. However, living conditions there differed little from the right bank. Narrow streets, high population density, and the lack of sewage were a shared problem across the entire city. The Seine played a key role in Parisian life. Barges carrying grain, wine, firewood, and building materials moved along the river every day. Along the embankments worked dockers, boatmen, and traders. Yet the Seine also served as the city's dumping ground. People threw waste into it along with refuse from tanneries, slaughterhouses, and dye works. Despite this, a significant portion of the population continued to use river water for everyday needs. Sanitation remained dire. There was no sewer system in the modern sense. Chamber pots were emptied directly onto the streets. In rainy weather, filth ran down the paving stones. In dry weather, it was carried by the wind. The police regularly recorded complaints about unsanitary conditions, but no systemic solutions existed. Housing conditions differed sharply by social class. The aristocracy and the high clergy lived in spacious mansions, hotels particulier, with inner courtyards, gardens, and service buildings. These residences were located in the Marais, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and along the Seine. Inside were dozens of rooms, separate kitchens, servants' quarters, and stables. Most Parisians lived in multi-story rental buildings where each room was rented out separately. Often an entire family lived in a single room, sometimes several families. There were not enough shared toilets and water supply was limited. Such buildings quickly became breeding grounds for disease and fires. The city's economic life revolved around trade and provisioning. Paris did not produce its own food and depended entirely on grain deliveries from the provinces. Bread was the foundation of the diet. The average resident of Paris consumed up to a kilogram of bread per day. Any disruption in supply immediately caused price spikes and unrest. By the middle of the 18th century, Paris was a city of sharp contrasts. It was a center of science, art, and administrative power, yet at the same time a city of poverty, unsanitary conditions, and social instability. These contradictions were built into the very structure of the city and gradually created the ground for crises that in the following decades would spill beyond markets and streets. In the second half of the 18th century, Paris increasingly felt the consequences of its own demographic and economic growth. By the 1780s, the city's population was approaching 650,000 people, yet the urban infrastructure was hardly modernized. New neighborhoods emerged spontaneously, built up by private landowners without a single plan and without obligations to lay out streets, water supply, or drainage. The outlying districts grew especially fast: Faubourg Saint-Antoine, Faubourg Saint-Marceau, Faubourg Saint-Jacques, and the neighborhoods beyond the Seine, where artisans, dockers, manufactory workers, and seasonal migrants from the provinces settled. Faubourg Saint-Antoine was one of the most densely populated and socially tense areas. It contained furniture workshops, tanneries, and textile production. Workers labored for 12 to 14 hours a day, often in poorly ventilated spaces. Wages remained unstable, and during economic downturns, many lost their jobs. This district would later become one of the key centers of revolutionary activity. The food supply question remained the central problem of urban life. Paris depended almost entirely on grain deliveries from surrounding regions: Brie, Beauce, Picardy, and Burgundy. Any disruption in supply caused by bad weather, crop failure, or speculation immediately affected prices. The state tried to regulate the bread market by setting maximum prices and controlling traders, but these measures often produced the opposite effect. The years 74 to 75 were especially difficult. After the liberalization of the grain trade under Louis XVI, prices rose sharply. In the spring of 75, Paris and its surroundings saw the so-called flour wars, guerre des farines. Crowds intercepted carts of grain, looted warehouses, and forced merchants to sell bread at a fair price. In some cases, royal troops intervened. In Paris itself, the police recorded dozens of clashes between the population and law enforcement. Bread was not merely a food product. It was the foundation of social stability. A working family spent 50 to 70% of its income on bread. An increase of the price by just a few sous could mean hunger. Police reports from the late 70s regularly mention fainting from exhaustion, rising child mortality, and a growing number of beggars. The healthcare system was in critical condition. Paris's main hospital remained the Hôtel Dieu, located next to Notre Dame. It could hold up to 3,000 to 4,000 patients at once, but it was chronically overcrowded. In one hall, there could be patients with injuries, infectious diseases, and women in labor. Medical instruments were rarely disinfected, and ventilation was minimal. Mortality at the Hôtel Dieu in certain years reached 20%. Other institutions, La Salpêtrière and Bicêtre, simultaneously functioned as hospitals, shelters, asylums, and prisons. These complexes were more instruments of social control than of treatment. The situation was especially harsh for women and children placed there for vagrancy or immoral behavior. Epidemics remained a constant threat. In the 18th century, Paris regularly experienced outbreaks of smallpox, typhus, dysentery, and measles. Smallpox was particularly deadly. In some years, it took up to 10% of the child population. Attempts to introduce variolation, an early form of vaccination, met resistance from some physicians and clergy. Fires posed another serious danger. Most houses were built of wood, and open hearths and candles were used indoors. Narrow streets hindered access for firefighting crews. After the devastating fire at the Hôtel Dieu in '72, which destroyed a significant part of the building, authorities for the first time seriously discussed the need to rebuild hospitals and improve fire safety, but financial and bureaucratic obstacles slowed reforms. Parisian policing was considered one of the most advanced in Europe. The city was divided into districts, each overseen by commissioners and inspectors. They kept detailed reports on taverns, theatres, brothels, and places where crowds gathered. Night patrols checked documents, dispersed assemblies, and detained suspicious individuals. Despite this, crime remained high. Pickpockets, card sharps, counterfeiters, and robbers were an integral part of urban life. Markets and squares played a special role as centres of information exchange. It was there that rumours spread about grain shortages, court conspiracies, and secret food stores. These rumours intensified a collective sense of injustice and could easily turn into a trigger for riots. At the same time, Paris remained Europe's intellectual centre. The cafes of the Palais Royal, bookshops along the Seine embankments, and private salons became venues for discussing politics and economics. People read banned pamphlets and debated the ideas of Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu. Diderot and D'Alembert's encyclopedia, despite prohibitions, circulated actively, especially in Paris. Yet there was a huge gap between the intellectual elite and the majority of the population. Ideas of freedom and equality were discussed in salons, while working districts fought for survival. This contrast became increasingly visible in the urban environment. By the end of the '80s, Paris was a city where economic pressure, demographic growth, a sanitary crisis, and informational tension intertwined into a single system. These processes were not abstract. They manifested daily on streets, markets, and in homes. The city was entering a period in which even a small shock could lead to a massive explosion. By the end of the '80s of the 18th century, Paris lived in a state of constant tension. The economic crisis that began after a series of poor harvests in '87 and '88 sharply worsened conditions for most residents. The winter of '88 to '89 was one of the coldest in a century. The Seine partially froze, mills stopped, and grain deliveries were delayed. In some districts, the price of bread more than doubled. Lines at bakeries began before dawn and often ended in fights. In the spring of '89, the situation became critical. Parisians increasingly spoke of a miller's plot and court speculation. Rumours circulated that grain was being deliberately hidden to cause hunger and suppress discontent. These rumours were fed by real facts: the discovery of grain stores belonging to private merchants and monasteries. Crowds regularly stopped wagons, checked their contents, and imposed their own fair prices. Against this backdrop, the convocation of the Estates General became an event of enormous significance. For the first time, in 175 years, representatives of the Third Estate had the opportunity to formally voice their demands. In Paris, cahiers de doléances, books of grievances, were actively compiled. They demanded lower taxes, the abolition of feudal obligations, equal access to offices, and fair justice. These documents were discussed in workshops, taverns, and markets, turning into political education for the masses. In June of '89, tensions rose sharply. The Crown's attempt to limit the activity of the National Assembly was perceived as betrayal. The presence of troops in the city increased. Royal regiments were stationed at strategic points, including around the Tuileries and the Champ de Mars. This caused anxiety. Paris had already seen soldiers used against civilians during previous disturbances. On the 13th of July, '89, the city stood on the brink of open uprising. Crowds smashed customs barriers, symbols of the tax yoke. Weapons shops were looted. Particular attention was drawn to monasteries and warehouses where, it was believed, grain supplies were stored. That day, the Saint-Lazare prison was attacked. Prisoners were freed, the buildings were looted, and food was distributed among the population. On the 14th of July, crowds moved toward the Bastille. The fortress was hardly used as a prison by then, but it remained a powerful symbol of arbitrary power. Inside was gunpowder needed to arm the city militia. After several hours of negotiations and gunfire, the fortress was taken. The governor was killed, his head displayed on a pike. This moment became a turning point. Power in Paris effectively passed to the people. After the fall of the Bastille, the city changed rapidly. The National Guard was formed to patrol the streets. Old municipal structures collapsed. New committees took control of provisioning, security, and order. The streets filled with cockades, posters, and improvised rallies. For the first time, Paris felt itself to be a political subject. In 90 and 91, the city became the arena of constant political activity. Clubs, the Jacobins, the Cordeliers, gathered thousands of listeners. Meetings were held in former monasteries and churches that had lost their religious function. Newspapers and leaflets circulated in enormous quantities, shaping public opinion. Parisians were learning to be citizens, but this process was accompanied by conflict and violence. Economic difficulties did not disappear. Despite reforms, inflation intensified and assignats depreciated. Workers demanded fixed prices and guaranteed employment. Women played an increasingly visible role in protests, especially in food marches. It was they who, in October of '89, marched on Versailles, forcing the king to return to Paris. In '92, tension turned into open radicalization. The storming of the Tuileries Palace and the overthrow of the monarchy marked a new stage. Paris became the capital of a revolutionary state. Old palaces and mansions were requisitioned, streets were renamed, churches were closed or turned into temples of reason. The years 93 to 94 were the bloodiest. The Revolutionary Tribunal operated almost without pause. The Place de la Révolution, today's Place de la Concorde, became the site of daily executions. Crowds gathered to watch the guillotine at work. Those executed included aristocrats, priests, and former revolutionaries. An atmosphere of fear and suspicion permeated the city. After the fall of Robespierre in '94, Paris gradually emerged from the regime of terror. Yet the city had already been irreversibly transformed. The social structure, the system of power, the relationship to space and symbols, everything had become different. The old Paris was disappearing, giving way to a new, revolutionary city. By the end of the century, Paris remained the largest political and symbolic center of France. Its streets carried traces of destruction, rebuilding, and violence. But it was precisely here that a new type of urban life took shape. Politicized, mass, involved. 18th century Paris did not end quietly, but in flames, becoming the starting point for a new era in European history. Write in the comments which city and which era you would like to see on the next journey, and perhaps it will come to life in our next video. As always, see you in the past.